Mic check, mic check.
Where's Brad? Okay. Yeah. 12:26. You're on. Okay. Is this live? Oh. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the session this morning. I know several of you have been able to be in and out because you have other duties. I'm Public Service Commissioner Tony O'Donnell, representing Southeast portion of Montana. I'm very pleased at the number of legislators who are here, who are very much interested in this resource adequacy issue as well. It's my honor to introduce the speaker who has important things to say rather than myself. I will say this. This is nearing the end of my 6th year as a commissioner here. And I've gone to all but one of the national meetings of our National Association and had interactions with several commissioners of the federal regulatory agency called FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And you would think possibly that the commissioners there would tend to look down on lowly state commissioners. But I want to let you know that I have encountered exactly the opposite. There have been all the commissioners that I can recall have been incredibly personable people, very easy to talk to. This commissioner here, in just a few months ago, I was at a meeting and he said, not only does he, as a FERC commissioner, want input from state commissioners, he repeated it like 3 or 4 times in a row to emphasize it at one particular session. I think we got the point on the whole thing. It's very refreshing to have somebody in a position such as his who really cares about the information from trickling in from below, basically. You know, I've been impressed with Commissioner Danley for a long time, immensely personable. And what I would consider now, as a Christian, I don't want to call anybody wicked, but the term wicked smart really seems to apply, you know, here very much so. I'm a huge fan. Now, in terms of actual bio introduction, I'll rely upon the Federalist Society because I trust them very much. And their rendition there of Commissioner Danley's background is that Commissioner James Danley was nominated commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on February 12, 2020, and confirmed as a commissioner by the United States Senate on March 12, 2020. Danley served as chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from November 5, 2020 to January 21 of 21. Danley formerly served as general counsel to FERC. Prior to joining the commission, he was a member of the Energy Regulation and Litigation Group at Skadden, Orps, Slate, Maher. Few people are going to pronounce that correctly, but in Montana, we know how to pronounce that term, and Flom, LLP. Prior to this, Danley served as a law clerk to Judge Danny Boggs at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit. He was a managing director of the Institute for the Study of War. Not exactly what you would expect from this. It's a military think tank in Washington, D.C., and served an international affairs fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. Danley is a former U.S. Army officer who served 2 tours in Iraq, first with an infantry company in Baghdad, and then on staff at Multinational Force Iraq, receiving a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Danley earned his Juris Doctor from Vanderbilt University Law School and his bachelor's degree from Yale University. He is licensed to practice law before the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. And it is my great pleasure to introduce FERC Commissioner James Danley.
Good afternoon. I appreciate that effusive introduction there. And this is quite a venue in which to have a speech. It is absolutely beautiful. So I appreciate being invited here. Just in response to the point about how personable the FERC commissioners are, we do generally, and I in particular am always interested in hearing what the state commissioners have. FERC's jurisdiction is narrow. It's only over the rates for the sale of power in interstate commerce for resale and over rates for transmission services. And also the Natural Gas Act for pipelines. siting and rates there too. But those are narrow but profound jurisdictional powers that are given to us. The vast majority of this business of utility regulation is done by the states. And the states are absolutely required for us to discharge our duties properly, and we have to have their input. And if anything, I would say I want more of it all the time, knowing that resources are constrained and not every state commission can participate in every one of our proceedings. I nevertheless think that to the extent that the states can tell us what they think they need to, you are much closer to the ratepayers than we are, remote and distant off in Washington. You are the ones that have to actually deal with the nitty gritty of the delivery of the services to the ratepayers. And on that subject, one of the problems that I've had with the last couple of years of many of the initiatives that have been undertaken by the commission is that we seem to have more and more good ideas, the consequences of which are going to be borne primarily by the states and the state commissions. And even if they technically fall within our jurisdiction under the very broad, I would say almost limitlessly broad practices affecting rates that apparently we've been informed that we have, I nevertheless think that we should exercise as much prudence as possible to burden the states and the state commissions as little as we can, and only do so in the most compelling circumstances. But that's all by the by. So thank you for the introduction. So the subject is resource adequacy. And I'm going to talk about a specific aspect of it, which is that in the West, there has been a growing enthusiasm in some quarters to create new or join existing markets, in part in order to solve the resource adequacy problems that are looming on the horizon. I take, of course, no position, being a committed and enthusiastic federalist, as to whether the states or their utilities join a market, but I do think that it would be wise for everybody to pause and think and do it deliberately if in fact they wish to join a market. There are reasons for this. I think that often the promises of markets are not necessarily delivered. I think that people may have misapprehensions as to how the markets function and whether they deliver on the promises that are often put forth. And you have to know what it is you're giving up. And we have some good examples of potential rocky shoals to be avoided should states go ahead and join markets. And before I get into each of those subjects, I'll touch on each one of them in a moment. I should mention that I am 100% pro-market. I am a free marketeer. But what I am for is markets that function properly, and I'm not for poorly functioning markets. Given the choice between a market that doesn't function correctly, and functioning correctly means that price formation is properly conducted such that rational allocation of capital by market participants can actually be achieved, right? If you cannot get that in your market design, and I would argue that in our for jurisdictional markets, we're by and large not meeting that challenge, then it is probably preferable for the sake of ratepayers to be in a more traditionally organized public utility commission with the ordinary oversight that's been the paradigmatic method of regulating utilities from the very beginning. So in order to get into the subject of entering a market with your eyes wide open, it's worth taking a moment to simply review the history of how we regulate utilities. And before people get nervous that this is going to be a long homily, I'll make it very quick and to the point. So when we began this experiment of public utility regulation in the very early days, when we had small little competing outfits all vying for customers, we've all seen those pictures presumably of the wires strung all over the place, helter-skelter. It became apparent that the economies of scale that could be granted to, or the benefits of which could go to the ratepayers that came with a franchise monopoly utility were valuable, and that we wanted to harness them and take advantage of those economies of scale. The problem with that is once you install a franchise monopoly utility, that monopoly utility can begin extracting monopoly rents. And so to avoid that, we created, and this is well before the Federal Power Act and the creation of FERC, the states created regulatory oversight mechanisms that attempted to ensure that the rates charged for the provision of services were some sort of a proxy for what the rates would have been charged had that been the result of a competitive market, right? So you create a rate-making mechanism that ensures that the rates are just and reasonable. This is historically based on cost of service showings in front of the commission. And the commission determines that the appropriate just and reasonable rate is a rate that provides not just the constitutional irreducible minimum of the return of investment, without which, of course, there would be a taking that would be illegal. But on top of that, the statutorily required return on investment that allows for further development of the utility and the attraction of capital for it to conduct its business. Okay, that is the paradigmatic method of doing it. Over time, that proxy for competitive outcomes, which was the rate making process, FERC decided that it was going to try to take more direct advantage of the actual powers of the marketplace. And so we developed this system of market structures. And the odd thing about that is that we then, to replace the stand-in for the competitive outcomes that the rate-making process produced, we now created markets that were going to themselves use competitive processes to come to rates that we deemed just and reasonable, which was the proxy for the competitive outcome. So we now have a double nested set of competitive outcomes as proxies for one another. The problem with this in some of our markets is that all of the required guardrails that ensure that those competitive processes are in fact competitive, many of those guardrails have been gotten rid of and are not being properly observed. So the best example of this is the removal, and of course I've written quite a bit on this, the removal of the minimum offer price rule in some of our markets. These are issues that are currently pending before the courts, and so they're non-jurisdictional. I can talk about them. The removal of the minimum offer price rule means that the market does not prohibit the exercise of buyer-side market power. The minute you create a market mechanism that allows for market power to be exercised, and in this case, the exercise of market power comes in the form of subsidies from states who are pursuing particular state public policies, you make that mechanism of the market that creates those price signals that, remember the history I just said, were going to be the stand-in for the competitive market prices in a free market. That price signal formation becomes impossible. Now, I take no issue with the states subsidizing anything they want. The Federal Power Act's division of jurisdiction is unambiguous and complete. States are perfectly entitled to choose the generation mix within their borders. That is an absolutely retained power under the Federal Power Act. However, regardless of what policies the states want to follow and are entitled to follow, the federal government is still obliged to have just and reasonable rates. And our just and reasonable rates can't be, we cannot ensure ourselves we have just and reasonable rates when there is market power exercised. So why is this? And I give that example, the MOPR is just one. There are other examples I could give, but I'm not going to get into it. There's limited time, and I want to turn to questions because that's usually the most fruitful part of these discussions. When states subsidize particular resources because they're pursuing particular public policy goals, this can imperil badly the reliability of the electric system. It ensures that there are going to be entire categories of resources whose attributes are much needed that are not going to be competitive. And for example, if you have a market structure that has a capacity market, because the dispatchable generation typically has fuel costs, if you try to bid into the capacity market, taking your fuel costs into account, you will fail to clear it. That means that revenue stream is denied you. And so you are not going to be able to get that necessary revenue, and the likelihood of your going bankrupt is much higher. These are exogenous forces that are acting on the market and have ineluctable consequences for the market, but are not mechanisms of the market. And the market does not, markets that we observe, that we administrate don't properly prohibit that. When the West considers the promises of joining an RTO, I've often found that the discussion centers around the idea that, well, we're going to have access to electricity that we otherwise would have much more difficulty trying to get a hold of. They see economies of scale for the broader economy of the region as a whole. And there are often discussions about governance that animated much of the anxiety last decade and a half or so after the California energy crisis, and even developing the EIM because people were concerned about California being the primary mover for any market decisions. But as time has gone on, various regions have decided that they were going to try to get as many of those benefits as possible without going into a full RTO. We saw the development, as I said, of the EIM that is developing and increasing in the size and the number of utilities participating. The Southeast has created a sort of system a system that allows them to harness some of the values of the economies of scale without actually completely pledging themselves to a market. When you join a market, the governance is difficult in part because the transmission owners who join give up control of their assets. And as time goes on, we've seen in every single one of the markets we administrate, the voice of those transmission owners continuously diluted in the stakeholder process because more stakeholders are added and proportionally they have less of a say. there are many transmission owners who I think are somewhat ambivalent about the compact that they signed a long time ago. And those transmission owners are not the only ones. Some of the state commissioners are also somewhat, I wouldn't say regretful, that's probably stating it too strongly, but wonder if with the full light of knowledge they have now, if they would have been quite as enthusiastic to sign into markets as they did when the markets kicked off. So what is the solution to the problem of markets that I think are maladministrated by FERC? And I dissent on many of these orders. So FERC has issued them. Many of the guardrails have been removed. What is the solution here? Well, a commitment to the previous paradigmatic method of IRP and cost-based rate making is something that not every state commission is going to do. There are wide variances across the way the different state regimes are implemented and how the business of regulation is conducted. But certainly the slow incremental steps that have been taken in some regions, including the West, to move towards markets and get those benefits strikes me as being a fairly rational and conservative, with a small c, conservative way of approaching the problem. The other thing is the extent to which you can see in your own backyard the effects that the subsidies, and here I'm talking now about federal subsidies, not state subsidies, have had on the generation mix within your borders. That should be a sign as to exactly what the likelihood of those subsidies having an effect later should you join a market. The effects are profound, and you need merely look at the change in the generation mix in any of our administrative markets, or you can look at the nature and type of generation that are in the interconnection queues in the various markets to see what the effects of the subsidies are. If you look at MISO, for example, it is overwhelmingly probably, don't hold me to this number, but probably more than 95% intermittent generation. And that's driven by subsidies, which put those projects much closer to being in the black. So I am all for cooperation between the states. I'm not quite sure that we would necessarily, in the face of cooperation, divest ourselves of our jurisdiction over rates for transmission services, as was suggested earlier today. I think that's probably not an option available to us, but I'm all for state cooperation. And on the subject of transmission, that is another thing like markets that often people get the idea that they're going to be able to transmit their way out of resource constraints. And understand, by the way, when I talk about resource adequacy, I'm talking about the availability of generation and fuel to actually produce power. I'm not talking about reliability, which is the proper function of the bulk electric system. That's a completely different subject. That one is technical and engineering, and we have NERC standards for minimum reliability requirements. Resource adequacy, properly conceived of, is not making sure that the electricity highway and the bulk electric system functions, but rather that there are enough cars on the highway to actually get people places, right? That the power is generated to be transmitted. Transmission is not going to be a panacea for several reasons, one of which is it is extraordinarily expensive. And at the end of the day, we have seen in all of the markets we administrate increasing transmission costs. Now, part of this is driven by the fact that there are a lot of resources that want to come online, and they need transmission in order to get the power to market, in many cases for the purpose of capturing those tax credits that they're guaranteed should they actually produce and deliver power. When you see the all-in customer bills remain relatively steady or even rise in markets while the generation costs go down, that delta is coming from the cost of transmission, which is going up continuously. There comes a point at which it is no longer rational to continue building. We're not there yet, presumably, but there comes a point where it's no longer rational to keep building transmission when other generation solutions are better, both from a reliability standpoint. Now I am talking about the actual function of the BES and from economics. So basically my message to everybody here is markets do have benefits. Maladministrated markets are produce unforeseen consequences that everybody should be concerned about. And to the extent to which anybody is contemplating joining an RTO, they should take seriously the experience of the other regions like ISO New England and PJM and MISO, CAISO, ERCOT, and see what aspects of those markets they want. And to the extent to which an RTO is joined ultimately by a state or by the state's utilities, they should try to ensure to the extent they can that whatever agreements they enter into to join that market take into account the problems that have been faced by the predecessors who have blazed these trails before them. So that is my basic message. I'm happy to take questions from anybody. and the question can be on any subject. I am not shy about saying I'm not going to answer a question I don't want to. So feel free to ask whatever you like. Not everybody at once.
So, one thing, you talked about all the subsidies and about the marketplace. Have the massive amounts of subsidies, do you feel that they have irrevocably altered any effect of the marketplace of controlling of what's going to happen in the future? Or is it all controlled by federal subsidies?
Well, so it wouldn't just be, I talk primarily about subsidy. Those are the ones that are probably the most easily observable. But there are plenty of state policies that have effects on what the generation mix is going to be. I am less concerned about the sort of health and safety regulations because those are definitely within the state's purview. If a state decides that they want to have an entire generation fleet made up of nothing but hydro, or I mean, I'm making that up, that's crazy, but you get the idea, then that's their privilege to do that. Our markets are based on prices. And so the subsidies are particularly important to me because they have an immediate and obvious consequence for the clearing prices in the markets we administrate. Is it irrevocable, you asked? No, probably not. The implementation of good market policies, I mean, there's a lag time, right? Our markets are based upon forward contracts in which you, in the case of markets that have capacity markets, you pledge to be available 3 years forward. So any implementation of a new policy that I would argue is more responsible and ensures better price formation will probably take a period of time before it's actually, the effects of it are actually seen because these are forward markets. But no, I think the promise of markets is still real, and the markets can deliver great benefits. And I think a proper, clear-eyed assessment of what the weaknesses are, and we're going to be getting data as we go forward, right? These are iterative processes. They're very complicated systems, and we've been refining and changing our markets continuously for years now. So I think I don't think it's irrevocable, or I think you said irrevocable, right? But it certainly is problematic, and I question whether or not the rates are JNR, right? That is what it fundamentally comes down to from our standpoint. We have this pesky thing called the law, right? As we've been reminded, and the law requires our rates to be JNR. And so we're going to see if the rates that result from these policy changes are in fact just and reasonable. Anything else? I got time. I'm happy to take questions. Okay. For the sale of wholesale power in interstate commerce, yes, we have jurisdiction over that because it's in interstate commerce. If you sell power into the interstate transmission system in any way, the rates, terms, and conditions of the sales for resale are jurisdictional to the commission. So when you say, are they under it? Aspects of what they do are, because there are sales in interstate commerce for resale. There are other things that they do that we don't have anything to do with. So we, as I say, our jurisdiction is narrow. Yep. And the enactment of the Federal Power Act was a basic commerce clause enactment, right? We had a problem early on. It's not worth getting into the specifics of the case law, but we wanted to make sure that states would not give preferential treatment to people within their states versus those outside. This is basic commerce clause type stuff. So to the extent to which you are conducting business in a public good like electricity, the federal government has seen fit to ensure that the states cannot discriminate against each other and everybody is playing on an equal footing. All right, I see no other questions. Wait, I'm sorry, do you have one? Yep.
How do you see your role in ensuring that market science avoiding pitfalls there?
Well, I mean, my view is that we're supposed to follow the case law and ensure that the exercise of market power is remediated by market rules that ensure that it can't happen. Opinion is obviously divided. There were orders that I voted against, and they issued and they changed the design of some of our markets. But our job is to ensure that the markets that are jurisdictional to FERC produce rates that are just and reasonable. And there are any number of potential mechanisms by which you can ensure that markets are insulated from the effects of market power. People are very clever, and when you get Section 205 filings, which are the FERC tariff revision filings, you are often surprised by just how inventive utilities are coming up with ideas for how to solve one problem or another. So I'm not saying that, for example, the minimum offer price will be the only way to ensure that market power is not exercised. There could be any number of them, but the proper role for FERC is to ensure that whatever rates result from the market's formula are JNR, and we have assumed for years, and the courts have upheld the assumption that if the market is competitive, the rates that result are just and reasonable. They can be really, really high because that is often, not often, but sometimes the result of a competitive market. You can have competitive markets that produce very high prices. That happens when there is scarcity. But you can have no certainty that the resulting rates are JNR if people are exercising market power that warps the price formation. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is that that's our statutory mandate, is to ensure that the rates are just and reasonable. There is a completely separate policy question, which is, why would you have market mechanisms that purport to deliver the value of markets and the information and the rational decisions that markets make possible, if you were then going to undermine those markets and make it impossible for people to use information because they have no confidence in it? That's a separate policy question. I offer it for people's consideration. It seems to be incomprehensible to me that you would make such a set of decisions, but apparently here we are. Nope. Nope. Here, just talk loud. I can hear you. So I have given absolutely no thought to that, and I would be reluctant to shoot from the hip on trying to draw lines like that. I have not thought about it. So I am dodging your question the fairest way possible, which is by telling you that I'm going to dodge it because I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, I don't have one. Okay, I'm going to think about it now. So, all right, anything else before we end this?
Most organized markets have independent market makers.
Yes, they do.
Is there a bigger role to play in independent market makers in these markets to help create tariffs that get you to that highly competitive market? Because most of them don't have much. They advise, and that's about it.
They advise, they monitor, they report. In some cases, they take more active roles. They do things like mitigate bids. In some cases, there's an extremely varied set of roles for market monitors enshrined in the various markets tariffs. I would be reluctant to say that just as that by and large there is a bigger role to play. Remember that anybody who has an interest that meets our minimal administrative standing requirements is allowed to file a complaint under Section 206. That's the ultimate remedy for any rate that you believe to be not just unjust and unreasonable. And that disciplining mechanism of bringing the rates to commission scrutiny can do a lot to ensure that those markets are functioning properly if, and this is the big if somebody actually files a 206. And there seems to be a widespread reluctance to actually do so. As to the market monitors, the fact that they're independent doesn't mean that they don't have their own objectives in how they want the market to run. And I offer no criticism of the market monitors as generally as a construct, but I'm not certain that a single person whose job is to have sort of a remote view of all of the information in the market is necessarily the right one to, let's say, be given Section 205 authority to file tariff revisions unilaterally, if that's the sort of thing you're imagining. I'd be pretty reluctant to do that, because remember, RTOs are utilities. And logically speaking, if you are actually talking about a 205 filing right or something like that, which you hear about now and again, that would be the equivalent of name an investor-owned utility, Excel, right? Saying we're going to put a guy into Excel who is not immediately beholden to the board of the company or the CEO, who can go ahead and file 205s on behalf of Excel because in his view, he deems that his version better than theirs. Does that strike you as a credible mechanism? No. So the market monitors have been assigned and discharge a role that is, I mean, from FERC's standpoint, extremely valuable, because you have somebody who has a view, as I say, of the entire market and has unfettered access to the information, and they can raise issues, whether it be to their comments to the 205 filings that their own market files with us, or commenting on complaint proceedings, or making referrals to the Office of Enforcement if they think there's actual market manipulation going on. I'm not talking about market manipulation in the comments I've made. I'm talking about just standard garden variety failures with no malice by anybody because market design is flawed. And for those sorts of cases, market monitors are extremely useful, but I'd be reluctant to confer specific filing rights. But if you want to file a 205 that suggests that, I'm happy to happy to read it. I will. So, I am not certain what it is. I have, there are constraints on how much money people have to hire lawyers to file things. That's definitely true. And there's so much activity in both the state commission's dockets and in ours that you could easily run through even a generous litigation budget if you're a utility participating in all of them. There also sometimes seems to be a little bit of reluctance to file 206s against, that is, file complaints against the RTOs, in part because even though they are, as a matter of law, just utilities, that is what they are. There's this sense that is, I think, unjustified that they're a category apart. They're not. And because of that, I think, I get the impression that people feel that attacking the tariff of a RTO is somehow or another attacking FERC or something, like attacking the regulator because there are jurisdictional RTOs. They should just dismiss that idea immediately if they're thinking that. The utility commissioners, in my experience, don't get upset because people file complaints, especially if they are well pleaded, sincerely pleaded complaints that are pointing out what they believe to be, the utility believes to be a flaw, or the complainant believes to be a flaw in a tariff structure. There's a reason why that remedial authority exists. It's in order to give people the opportunity to challenge the rates on file. So, but I think those are the two reasons. I for the life of me can't understand why people wouldn't do it more. So here I am exhorting people, file 206s. If you think the rates are not JNR, do it. We will listen to you. So, okay. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And one last thing before I go, sorry, to the extent to which anybody wants to talk about market design or anything having to do with FERC or anything like that, you can always reach out to my office. I'm always pleased to talk to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Danley. Just, pardon me, a couple of housekeeping things. First, when it comes to putting an event like this together. Whoever the person was that said, "Don't sweat the details," should have been taken out and shot. And there are two folks on our staff who have absolutely been phenomenal with regard to riding herd over the details for this event. And I want to offer our appreciation to both Patricia and Shauna. Step up here and let us see you. Thank you so much. And with that, we will reconvene back in the Supreme Court chambers at 1:15. Thank you all very much for being here with us.